Hello, my friends, and welcome to the best podcast that you are listening to right this very second. I'm Pete Dominic, coming to you from the solar-powered shed in Rockland County, New York, and I have a very special guest who's written one of the most important books of our time. Several very important books, but his new book that I talked to him about today is really good and very important, enlightening the hidden roots of white supremacy and the path to a shared American future. Robert P. Jones of the Public Religion Research Institute is back on the show. He does not disappoint. This book is so important, and I really hope you listen to our interview and get the book. Now, thank you to everybody who was at the Republican primary debate #1 watch party last night. I think we are going to have a lot of fun with these debates. We certainly had quite a bit of fun last night. Almost 60 of you showed up, a bunch of new faces, a bunch of people I haven't seen or heard from in a long time, and I think it went pretty well. I encourage you to come to these debates because I fast forward through the boring Mike Pence speeches, and we make a lot of jokes. We take breaks when people say really, really upsetting things, and we talk to each other and communicate in this community. And I hope that you'll do that with me tonight at our regularly scheduled hangout, and maybe even in person tomorrow night. Friday, I'll be in D.C. A few of you are going to be joining me to hang out. If you haven't reached out yet, then do it now. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Now, at this point, I'm sure you've seen all kinds of great expert analysis on the debate last night. Who won, who lost, who impressed, who did not. How did the moderators do? They were terrible. Fox News, etc. I'll just say, you know what? There's a couple things I'll quickly say. Ron DeSantis had the furthest to fall, and I would say he did because he was scared of Vivek Ramaswamy, who is yelling at him right next to him. When you're the governor of a state and every day people are answering to you and kissing your ass, and then someone isn't doing that, it can be shocking and jarring, I bet. And Ron DeSantis looked scared of the young man that was next to him. He really legitimately looked like he was coming apart. Mike Pence thinks that Jesus chose him. He's so boring, surprisingly fiery. Chris Christie with the best prepared line of the night, calling Vivek Ramaswamy Chat GPT, and admiringly enjoying the boos he was getting from the crazy people in the audience at Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Tim Scott, a non-factor, looked nervous, flubbed his lines. Nikki Haley sounded strong, and she was really angry, righteously, it would seem, at the idiots and the way they were presenting their cases. She played the gender card at one point, which I thought was fine and effective. Maybe not to conservatives in a Republican primary, but who am I missing? I'm missing them because I'm forgetting them. The guy from North Dakota, Howard, the guy was a nervous wreck. He didn't get much time. Asa Hutchinson, are you serious? The comb over alone is a joke, much less how he wants nuance and a little bit of a conversation that makes some kind of sense on these issues. They took one question from the audience, a video question, I should say, a taped question from a young Republican about climate change, and none of them even really answered it. Of course, this entire thing is a futile exercise because the nominee is most likely going to be Donald Trump, and he wasn't even there, which is the other big news of today. He'll turn himself in. He'll get a mugshot, I guess, like the rest of them, which is what dominated my timeline yesterday on social media. And this is a much bigger, more important story than the debate. So I think that's probably the thing to learn more about, read about, think about. But on today's show, I've got Robbie Jones, and I am going to get right to that because it is an almost, 45-minute conversation. It's such an important book that he's written, a third book that he has written along these lines. White Too Long was published back in 2020. White Too Long, the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. He followed that up in 2016 with a book called The End of White Christian America. And this new book picks up where he left off, picks up where Nicole Hannah-Jones left off with the 1619 Project, and includes the story of Native Americans and goes way, way back. It's such an important story that he is telling us. It's a history book, it's a book about now, and it's a book with hope in it. I think you're going to love it. I hope that you'll get it. Robbie P. Jones has a really interesting personal story, having been born and spent most of his young life as a very religious Baptist in Mississippi. He's the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He has an awesome newsletter, Substack, robertpjones.substack.com, which I highly recommend you subscribe to. He's got a PhD in religion and a master's in divinity, a bachelor's in computing science and mathematics. The dude is smart and a really, really good guy. Very happy he's back here on the program again with me, and I encourage you to listen to past interviews and definitely get this book, Robert P. Jones, right now on Stand Up. All right, back with Robbie Jones, whose amazing new book is a must-read. It's a important history and some hope, I think, is one way to frame it. Robbie, welcome back. Congratulations.
That sounds just about right. Thanks for having me back on.
This is a continuation of the work that you started a long time ago, and I think the re-education that you have given yourself and brought us, your readers, along with you. Man, you could meme up any one of us, but certainly your journey from your youth in Mississippi as a Baptist to the author and professor, basically, that you are now, Robbie. How would you describe the bookends of what your life and how you've taught yourself along with us?
Well, as you say, it's been something of a journey. Yeah. So, I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi as a Southern Baptist, the largest evangelical denomination. I was that kid who was at church like 5 days a week, even as a teenager, all the way through high school, went to a Baptist college, then went on to get a seminary degree at a Southern Baptist seminary in Texas. So, and then I think re-education is the right word. I mean, it really has been, even after I got a PhD in religion, but it has really been the last, 10, 15 years that I've been on this journey to try to really disentangle the ways in which white supremacy has been wrapped up in American Christianity. And, this last book is my installment to try to trace it all the way back, since before the beginning of the country, and then look at some very contemporary ways in which people are doing the hard work, I think. And I think hopefully and offering some hope for a better future.
You certainly do all of that. In so much in this book I never knew, and I'm enraged by that. How often have you found yourself, especially your research for this book, angry?
Yeah, I mean, there were some, I can use profanity on your show, right?
We welcome it here.
There was times where I think the only word I could think of was like, fuck, I would just push back from the table or from the keyboard and just really, and again, I consider myself fairly well read and have a PhD in religion and and read a lot of history. And there was so much here. And I think particularly the interconnections between kind of Native American history and African American history in this country that I just did not know and never really been taught.
So let's talk about that. I feel like the introduction or the prologue of your book titled Before America should be published on its own, just on its own. I mean, maybe you can publish that some way in sections on your Substack after the book is out there or something, because I want everybody to read Before America. But talk a little bit about in the prologue and what the effort was here in this book and the difference between kind of the 1619 Project and what a lot of Native American leaders and scholars have been outspoken about, what that kind of misses to some extent. I feel like you connect the two in this book on your own journey of learning about them both.
Yeah, well, the book opens with this remarkable story that, again, I didn't know. I stumbled upon it as I was reading Minnesota history, actually, of all things. And in brief, it's the story of this remarkable man and his family and companions. His name was Robert Hickman, and he was an enslaved person in Missouri who was literate and got wind of the Emancipation Proclamation. And even though it did not apply to Missouri, we should remember this because Missouri was a border state and not a state in full rebellion. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply. And yet he thought, you know what? I'm going to take this opportunity and we're going to make a run for it. And so he and a number of people in his family and neighbors set off on a raft, just pushed out into the Mississippi River, hoping to get picked up by, somebody on the Union side of the Civil War. And they did. They got picked up by a steamboat that was steaming north to Fort Snelling, just up around Minneapolis. And they towed them all the way there. And so, there's a story that's kind of amazing story of risk and courage and this group finding freedom. But if you kind of stay with the steamboat, it docks, it lets them off, and they go on. But its next assignment, the steamboat's assignment, which is called the Northerner, its next assignment was to pick up this cargo of disheveled Dakota people who had been forced into concentration camps for an entire winter. Many of them had died, and they were being exiled and shipped out of the state of Missouri there. So these things happened at this, the freedom and emancipation for one, and genocide and exile for Native Americans, all in kind of one little episode. I think it's a kind of a vignette for the complicated ways these histories are intertwined.
But there's so many episodes, and you pick some, I think, and we can talk about how you pick those, but they're not all of them where you connect in both part 1, part 2, and 3. You talk about the Mississippi Delta, and then you go to Minnesota, and then you go to Tulsa, Oklahoma before the Tulsa race massacre, and then part 4, of course, is the rivers before us. The way that the search for hope in history is that final part. The way that you laid this book out, the way that you chose to write this and connect these different periods in history is so important. So let's start, though, before we get to the Delta, with staying in the prologue to talk about something called the Doctrine of Discovery, which I'm ashamed if I had ever learned of that or heard about that. And this is an issue, obviously, that I've been studying for a long time and interviewed so many experts, and I've forgotten. What is this, and why is it so important to our founding?
Yeah.
The Christian Doctrine of Discovery.
Well, I'm right there with you, right? Again, all this kind of education in religion and history, and yet it was not something really on my radar as something significant for American history. And yet, the more I kind of delve into it, I think I refer to it in the book as kind of the hermeneutical key or the Rosetta Stone for understanding kind of how our moral compass got set from since before the country. So, I mean, the short of the story is that, we all learned this little rhyme in elementary school about 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but we don't think much about the year that I think is more significant. That's the next year, 1493, when he goes back to Spain, petitions Ferdinand and Isabella for more provisions, more soldiers, more supplies to come back, right, with a real conquest there. And in order to do that, he not only needs permission from the political authorities, but they want a moral justification for doing it. And so who do they appeal to? They appeal to the head of the church in Rome, so to the Pope. And there's this whole series of documents that get developed in the late 15th century. So this is like between 1450 and this last one, 1493. And essentially what the Christian church puts forward is this idea that it's a justification for conquest by European powers. And it basically says that if they encounter any non-Christian peoples, and that's the defining category, right? If they are not Christian, that they then have the blessing of the church and the explicit authority of the state to go in to conquer, take the land, take the goods. And then, in this document, again, kind of coming out of the Vatican, are these words, and to submit them to perpetual slavery, right? I mean, that's the words coming from the church directing the political powers.
To invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens. Is that how it's pronounced? That's Muslims?
That's Muslims, yeah.
And pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. These documents, this Pope was a motherfucker. Nicholas V, never heard of this, but this is like so important. It's such an underpinning, and whether it ever gets referenced, whether people know that that's what our behaviors, our attitudes, and laws are based on, they do now, because of your bringing this back up and re-educating us. Tell me more about the Doctrine of Discovery and how it animated so much of our history and origin.
I mean, one visual I think we are familiar with, but we don't realize, I think, what was going on are these paintings of Columbus landing or De Soto, other, conquistadors landing on these shores. And what you usually see in those paintings, right, is someone kind of reading something, a big cross usually being erected in the ground there, and then all the implements of war. And so those are symbolic, of the Doctrine of Discovery, right? The power of the state and the sword. and that cross, right? The moral and religious authority of the church. And so when they were doing that, those weren't just for show, right? It wasn't just a kind of empty ritual. They were actually enacting what they thought to be rituals that would give them the legal authority to do what they were about to do. So those little paintings aren't just kind of quaint, oh, that's cute, they put up a cross, but they were doing that as a way of legitimizing and making good on these claims of the Doctrine of Discovery, of staking that land for the church.
A legal claim. Yeah. They were covered legally. It didn't matter. It'd be like me going to your house and taking it and it being legal. Am I right? Like me
that's right. And it did not depend on the knowledge of the indigenous peoples at all. They could be completely ignorant of it. It didn't depend on any of that. It was just whoever was the first European country to come and lay claim. That's whose rights were respected by the other Christian nations and the church.
It's really important, this beginning before America, like I said, this chapter, and everybody needs to get the book just for that. But let's get more into it because it's such an important read. So many things. Again, you thought you knew about Emmett Till, the murder of Emmett Till. I guess I didn't. Part 1, the Delta. Before Mississippi, the murder of Emmett Till, and commemoration and repair in Mississippi, which ties in with some very current or recent events. President Biden commemorating it as a national landmark, both in Chicago and Mississippi. Why did you choose to go to Mississippi? I mean, you have your roots there. I'm sure that had something to do with it. But why Mississippi? Why Emmett Till?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is I have a personal connection there. I've been growing up in Jackson. But I also think, the story of Emmett Till is so interesting because on the one hand, it became such a rallying cry for the early civil rights movement. Rosa Parks talked about thinking about Emmett Till during her work. John Lewis talked about thinking about and being affected by the Emmett Till story. So for so many early civil rights activists, this story and this awful, really lynching of Emmett Till in Mississippi was so formative. But and you could go around the world and people knew Emmett Till's name. But what was striking is that in the Delta, in Tallahatchie County, where these events took place, if you had driven through there as late as 2000, there was literally nothing on the ground to tell you any of that stuff happened. They had remodeled the courthouse where the kind of ridiculous trial took place, where he was acquitted. His killers were acquitted within an hour by an all-white male jury there. But there was no signs, no memorials, and the story just wasn't being told. And I thought it was really remarkable that about 20 years ago, a group of citizens began to say, we need to tell the truth about this story. And this is still a very rural, fairly poor area of the country. So without many resources and in a small rural place in a very red state, a group of black and white citizens got together and decided we're going to try to tell this story. And they were, descendants of the planter class and enslavers and the descendants of enslaved and sharecroppers that came together to work to tell this story. So I thought it was just a really remarkable story that was on the ground about truth-telling, repair, and healing. And now, as you said, it's become that work over the last 2 decades has resulted in a new national monument.
But you connect Emmett Till, born July 25th, 1941, to a story that began 400 years before him on May 8th, 1541, when Hernando De Soto became the first documented European to reach the Mississippi River, likely landing south of Memphis near Mississippi County that bears his name today, you say. And why are we connecting Emmett Till to Mr. De Soto?
Yeah. Well, one question is like, okay, so how do we get a society, right, that where two people can abduct in the middle of the night a 14-year-old boy, torture him, kill him, get acquitted, then confess, right, and still there's no huge uproar, right, among the white community? Like, how do we get a society that does that sets up Jim Crow, that fights for the Confederacy for the right to own other human beings? Like, so if we kind of trace it back, it's the same root, really. And before that story also, right. So my little Baptist college that I went to right outside of Jackson, Mississippi was called Mississippi College. And who were the mascot for that team? We were the Choctaws, right? Named after the Native American tribe that formerly inherited that space. And our little college was founded in the 1830s. As were many kind of institutions. And that's because that was right after the federal government forced the remaining Native Americans who hadn't already been killed off those lands, off to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. And so there's this sense of kind of white entitlement backed up by this idea of the superiority of Christianity and European civilization. It's the same forces that commit genocide and oppression to Native American peoples that enslave African Americans. It's the same moral root and motivation. So I really wanted to kind of see these stories. And when you understand it like that, this awful, awful, horrific crime, it becomes a little bit less of a mystery of how that could possibly happen.
It's really important, I think, what you're saying and connecting this history, because it is connected. I mean, you've got all this amazing data and polling at PRRI, I think a new one released today, but that talks about and asks people important questions about history. And you can pick any one of them you want, Robbie, but, I think it might be a good time to just mention your work at PRI. Pick a question that reflects, I think, what we're saying here is that things that happened 400 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago matter today. That's the case that is being made by so many different experts across the spectrum of different expertise, from psychology to history to sociology to criminology. I don't know what else you want to say, but there's no doubt that what happened a long time ago still matters today. But according to your polling, maybe not for a lot of people.
Well, one place we asked a question that I explicitly kind of helped write the question to make it reflect as best I could the core idea of the Doctrine of Discovery. And so we actually asked people whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement that, the U.S. was intended by God to be a promised land where European Christians could set an example for the rest of the world. So do you agree or disagree with that statement? That's who America is. And, we find that 30% of Americans today agree with that statement. And when you look at the groups like white evangelical Protestants or Republicans, it's a majority of those two groups that agree with that statement. So
if you believe that was God's intention, then what else? I mean, do we really need any studies or books or anything else? I mean, if that's what you honestly believe, then also it's going to take a lot to disabuse you of that really racist, white supremacist belief.
Yeah, I mean, it's straightforward white supremacy. It's straightforwardly anti-democratic. Yeah. It is fundamentally incompatible with the idea of a pluralistic democracy. And yet, I think this is one of the things I became more clear about in this book, is that we've had these twin streams even before America. That's kind of why I began all the way back, right? But the kind of development of the country brings these two streams fully together. I think that's one thing that the 1619 Project did for us, right? Is it took us out of that room in Philadelphia with a bunch of white men in their knickers, around a table to a broader story. But this fundamental question of, are we a nation intended by God to be a promised land for European Christians, or are we a pluralistic democracy where everybody stands on equal footing as citizens? These are two fundamental questions that I think we've never actually fully resolved in the country. And
that this doctrine of discovery, I think it's fair to say you're arguing and saying, is still animating people's behaviors, as well as our elections, our media, our laws. Whether or not people know the history of it, it is something that they actually believe within their core. It's a belief of theirs, and maybe not exactly as it's worded or every part of it, but certainly the remnants of it are very much animating the ideology. Even that the United States was is created by God, for us, by us, whatever attitude. It's the greatest country God ever made. All of this religious stuff that makes America somehow better in God's eyes than the rest of the world. It's all as a root of that kind of doctrine. It's fair to say. You've got it all in here, I think, in the book. You spell it out.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, we hear a lot today about this, relatively new term, a Christian nationalism, right, that we've done some round polling around. But it is the doctrine of discovery, right, at its root. It's just the newest iteration of this sentiment that white Christian people are who the country is for and are intended to be kind of at the top of the political heap, at the top of the economic heap, the top of the cultural heap. And everybody else, it's a hierarchical worldview, right, with white Christian people at the top and everybody else kind of in their place at some lower level, right, in the pyramid.
Talk to me about, let's stay in Mississippi in this first part of your book and Emmett Till and the reaction to the verdict there, because when you reference Emmett Till, I feel like I could not obviously identically reference a similar issue that's happened recently around someone falsely accused or murdered by the police and so on. But there are so many parallels between what happened with Emmett Till, but even more specifically, the kind of the reaction of the verdict that leads us next to Tulsa. But let's stay with Emmett Till, and we can move on to Oklahoma next. The reaction to the verdict, you write about that, and it seems so similar to things we hear today.
Yeah. Well, you said, this is also notable that, the entire jury was all white men. And what's notable about that is not just that was the result, but, the jury is picked from a pool of registered voters. That's who's eligible to serve on juries. And at that time in Tallahatchie County, there were exactly 0 registered African Americans registered to vote in Tallahatchie County because of terrorist activity, threats, and other ways of discouraging African Americans to vote. So not only were there no people selected, there were not even any eligible people to be selected on a jury in Tallahatchie County then, But I think that the biggest thing around the white community, even among those who were kind of appalled, was just to forget. Like, we're just going to push this under the rug, sweep it under the rug. We're not going to talk about it. And that's a common theme, right? Whether we're in Tulsa or Minnesota, we have these acts of white racial violence. And then even among the sort of white people of goodwill, the biggest thing is okay, that's over. We're not going to talk about it. We're just going to sweep it under the rug. And so I think part of what's going on is we're in this moment of remembering and recalling this history that has been suppressed. It's been hidden. And, like most things, when they're suppressed or hidden, they result in all kinds of unhealthy they fester, right? All kinds of unhealthy behavior. I think the only way to come to health is to bring them to the light of day and deal with them.
It's interesting to hear you talk about any, history from the 1950s, much less before it, because we can watch what you're saying be playing out now from the rewriting of what happened on 9/11 and more, I think, prominently, January 6th. I mean, that was 3 years ago. We watched it on television. And now what we're also watching, listening, and reading is the retelling, the rewriting, or the denial. Yeah. And I think that if history can be rewritten in 3 years, certainly it's easier to rewrite things that people didn't actually live through and read the headlines in 50 years ago or further, right?
Right, with video footage, right? We've actually got footage, of these things. No, I think that's right.
Say more about the commemoration and repair in Mississippi that you kind of end that section with. You mentioned the memorial that President Biden just dedicated to Emmett Till in both Chicago and Mississippi. But I think it's also important to remember that the previous memorials that were there weren't national and weren't federal, like a sign, whether it was state or whatever. They were all shot up over and over and over. Those literally were shot. They were fired upon, hit by hundreds of bullets. And so the point of it is, I feel like Mississippi under this Governor Reeves and Jackson and their water problems, and the Mississippi that you're writing about in the 50s, I wonder how far we've come.
Well, and there's another story I'm just writing about, actually, that in Rankin County, Mississippi, was right outside of Jackson, just right out of the headlines. There were just this past week, 6 white police officers who were arraigned and confessed to torturing 2 African-American men who there were 6, white police officers off duty, got a call, broke into these 2 men's house without a warrant, tortured them for 90 minutes, ended up shooting one of them in the mouth during a mock execution, and then tried to cover the whole thing up. Right. And this is 2023 that this is happening. So I think we're, and they were explicitly motivated by the fact that they used racial slurs. They told them to get back on the other side of the river where they belonged, not on this side of the river, like these old segregationist, racist tropes here, and racial terrorism, right? So that's still happening today.
Jesus, I'm seeing the headline: multiple deputies fired after 2 black men file lawsuit alleging torture and attempted sexual assault in Mississippi.
Yeah. Yeah, straightforwardly racially motivated, right?
I mean, it feels hard to quantify progress in certain places.
And yet, I think that's right. And, being from Mississippi, I feel the weight of that. And yet, we have in Mississippi now, a civil rights museum funded by state dollars that's actually quite good and quite honest about the history, including a big exhibit on Emmett Till, and the Mississippi Department of Archives and History is sponsoring that. And again, I think seeing these folks that included, people on the
right.
kind of white side of the Emmett Till Memorial Commission having to come to terms with things that their grandparents did, right? It's not that far back, and it's a small community, so they all knew each other, and working through that nonetheless and they're all talking about, I want to make this a better place for the next generation. Like, that's what we're up to. We're going to kind of work on this. We're going to come across some healing and replacing those signs that were shot up. And I should say too, that those were not accidental. The one sign that got all the press was actually the sign that marked where Emmett Till's body was taken out of the Tallahatchie River. And to get there, I've been there, I went there for the book, but you have to drive down this farm road through a field to get to that sign. You're not like casually driving by it on, the highway. So people had to seek it out, right, in order to deface it. And that's the kind of resistance they're facing there. But I think also what I heard from many of the white residents is they were like, finally, we're going to face this. We're going to get it out in the open. And we are not going to hide from our past, and we're going to be able to create a different future.
Hiding from your past doesn't seem to work in any part of life.
No. Yeah.
Better to peel off the Band-Aid, rip it off, identify it, work on it, get to the root, make things better for yourself and for others. I think every spiritual, emotional, psychological philosophy probably preaches that. Let's, before we go to Oklahoma, get to Minnesota as you do. I didn't know about this. I knew of the Tulsa Race Massacre. I've only learned recently, though. I didn't learn about that in school. But I didn't know about the lynchings in Duluth, Minnesota. But before that, where do you want to start in Minnesota? Yeah. 386 years before those lynchings.
Right. Well, you think a similar thing in Minnesota, and I wanted to go somewhere that wasn't, the deep South or a deep red state. I mean, Oklahoma, let's not forget, every county in Oklahoma voted for Trump, right? Not a single county went blue. So it's a pretty conservative, pretty red state. But Minnesota, you can't get much closer to Canada, right there. And Duluth is right up there on the Great Lakes, right up on the tip of the lake. And so I wanted to tell the story because this is an American story. This isn't a Confederate story or a Southern story. It's an American story. And so I want to be really clear about that by telling the story in Duluth. So, I'll start with the lynchings, then go backwards. But briefly, in 1920, there was this lynching of 3 African-American workers who were in town for a single day working on an itinerant circus that was going through town. They were falsely accused by a white woman of raping her and then jailed and then subsequently lynched by a massive mob of 10,000 people estimated turned out for this lynching. At the time, that was about a tenth of the population of Duluth, right? So this is a place with very few African Americans. It's, heavily Catholic and Lutheran. And, when you think about things like, Minnesota nice, right? And the sort of wholesome Midwest, I kind of wanted to make sure I see this story in that light, and then nobody ever really brought to justice, for those lynchings either. But behind that, again, to kind of tell the story and to kind of understand the sentiment of kind of white Christian superiority is the story of the Dakota people in Minnesota. And I didn't know this either until I really started digging into it, that the largest mass execution that the federal government has ever completed was in Mankato, Minnesota. And it was 38 Dakota men who were simultaneously hung for their role in an insurrection against the federal government, who was, by the way, starving them and denying them their rights under the treaty that they had with the federal government. And so they rebelled because they were essentially starving. And then as a result, the authorities in Minnesota actually wanted to execute 300 men, sent this off to, at the time, it was during the Civil War, and it was Abraham Lincoln was the president. Sent this off to Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln commutes the sentences of all but 38, but then signs off on the execution of 38 men here. And what's also kind of reminiscent of this early story, he's considering this at the same time he's considering the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So these things hit his desk at roughly the same time. So he's got both of these things on his mind here. And so again, kind of emancipation for one group and this kind of continued oppression toward another group. This juxtaposition, I think, is, again, kind of part of the American story that we're still coming to grips with.
Really important section, and I could talk about just that or any part of this book for the entire time I have with you. But let's go to Oklahoma, to Tulsa, again, starting before the Tulsa race massacres in Oklahoma. You had, of course, Native Americans who were there as well. And, of course, they were seen as, you write, the Indian problem. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The fact that we have these two terms in American history, the Indian problem and the Negro problem, right, were terms that were thrown around by white Americans all the time, right? There are things to be solved, right? And what that really meant was, how can we sort of deal with them in ways that don't make us give up any of the stuff that we've taken from them, right? Or any of the ways that we benefited from their labor. But yeah, in Oklahoma, what struck me too, I didn't know a lot about the history of Oklahoma, but, for the longest time, that space where now we have this kind of funny looking state above Texas was on maps up until, 1800 or so as unsettled territory. It was just kind of this blank spot on the map that hadn't been claimed, by other territories. And essentially, the plan was, this plan that got hatched and that ultimately got put into play was, well, what we're going to do is we're going to just ship all of the Native Americans that are still in the Southeast, never mind the treaties. We're going to just ship them all off by force to Oklahoma. And so Oklahoma, its origins are essentially as a refugee dumping ground for people who were forced to bayonet point off their homes and off their lands from Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, all across the Southeast. Upwards of 20% of them died on the way. Some of these took place in the winter. Women, children, older people, no provisions really made, most of the time on foot, hundreds of miles, right? So you can imagine, and they got there with very little supplies as well. And then even then, after they get to Oklahoma, once it looks like Oklahoma's going to become a state, there's this kind of rush, right, for land by white settlers, in quotation marks, right, occupiers to take even what land was there for the most part for white.
It's crazy.
White people to occupy.
I knew none of it, and I'm just learning so much from this book. It's so important to be necessary reading. Let's go to May 31st, June 1st, 1921 in Tulsa, when mobs of white residents, you write, systematically attacked black residents and businesses of the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The precipitating event was the accusation by Sarah Page, a white 17-year-old, that she had been assaulted by a black 19-year-old, Dick Rowland, while she was working as an elevator operator on May 30th. Take us, pick up wherever you want.
Yeah, well, Tulsa, predominantly white city, but it did have a thriving, growing kind of middle class area called Greenwood. It also got dubbed Black Wall Street because of its businesses that were growing there. It was literally across the tracks from the white side of town in Tulsa. And there was this event, and the newspapers fanned the flames, literally fanned the flames, talking about this woman had been sexually assaulted, and white people just began gathering. And before you knew it, there were literally just roving bands of white people with guns and torches that were driving across the tracks to the black part of town, shooting indiscriminately any black person they could see, setting houses on fire, and even in some cases forcing people out. And then white women coming in with cars, loading up furnitures and valuables, taking it back to the white side part of town before they burned the house, down. And this continued. This was not just like one. This is the thing that kind of struck me about this event. It wasn't just kind of one night of passion, and people went to bed, put their kids to bed, had breakfast, got up, and started again the next day. Right. So this was kind of multiple days of violence in Tulsa. By the end of it, 300 African Americans are estimated to be dead. Thousands of more displaced, and then the white establishment really justified and the white churches. I got a hold of some of the sermons that were preached in the Sunday following, this, and essentially the most prominent pastors in town blamed the event on the black residents of Tulsa rather than on the white residents who wielded the violence.
crazy. It's crazy history, but it's not surprising for anybody who studied just a little bit of history, especially, I think, some people are often surprised by the religious underpinnings of the motivations for so much of this violence. But it was there then, and it is there now. And we've talked a lot about that as it relates to your daily work and recent work on the current events in this country and what motivates these people. But let me kind of, I guess, end our conversation where you end the book, part 4, The Rivers Before Us. You searched for hope in history. Where did you find?
Well, as I alluded to before, if you stay up at the top level, it's the loudest voices are often the ugliest, right? The most racist, the most hateful, the most bigoted. And so I think if you just kind of stay in the headlines or God knows, stay on social media, it's pretty bleak out there. But, when just little vignettes of, I went to a meeting of the Emmett Till Interpretive Center at the Bayou Bend Country Club outside of Sumner, Mississippi, where, by the way, Morgan Freeman is a member. Oh, and had a, in watching this group navigate these challenges, seeing kind of churches in Tulsa, the same church that had a kind of big, tall steeple, big, huge Methodist church that had the Methodist bishop justifying the violence right after that, had 100 days of repentance at the church in their predominantly white church, very, again, kind of upscale, socioeconomically church, trying to reckon with their role in these events 100 years later. So when I see things like that and I see what's happening at the local level, I think that's where I really get some hope from, that there are people beyond the headlines that are really working to change their communities, down at the neighborhood level, down at the community level. But for sure, they're facing some resistance, but I think they are also making some real headway, and they're changing the landscape of their city, right? So there are now memorials to these events that tell a different story than were there even 20 years ago, and I think that's progress.
You mentioned repentance. There's another R word, reparations. Yeah. You write a lot about that with some of these white churches as well as the population or citizenry, the rest of us.
On the question of reparations, I did come to kind of a realization. One of the biggest objections I hear white people giving about reparations, and whether we're talking about, again, Native American people or African American people, is that it's just too complicated, right? You hear just this kind of pragmatic, just let's ignore the moral part of it, but let's just kind of start with it's too complicated to figure out. But one of the things I was so struck by in this book and doing this history is that when white people and white Christian people had the opportunity to defraud, steal, kill, or otherwise dispossess Native Americans and African Americans, the number of ways they found to do that, or we found to do that, I should say, were astronomical. Like the creativity that flowed, right? Every gambit, scheme, you could imagine, right? To work around the law, to kind of, so that it ended up in our pockets. It was there. And yet when it comes to repentance and repair, we just want to throw up our hands. It's too complicated, right? But
no shortage of ideas when it comes to taking your stuff, right. But I can't think of any way to get it back to you.
Yeah. So I think we are at a moment where, I'm hoping that it's time for the creativity to flow the other way.
The issue I've read Ta-Nehisi Coates and others, writings on reparations. So I'm going to say something ignorant, but just to be kind of funny, but true. It's, you think about reparations actually occurring and the kind of fraudulence that would be perpetuated, just a guy like me being like, yeah, I'm 50% Choctaw. That's right. Where's my check? Like people just trying to defraud and trying to pretend that they have any kind of lineage or any kind of case to make would be uniquely American. What do we say about where we're at today and what's happening here at the beginning of a presidential election as the issues that you've been writing about seemingly animate all of the candidates? There's a lot of not hiding anymore. The hoods are off. And I wonder what, if anything, you think would be appropriate to be talked about, to be asked about at the Republican debates or to these Republican candidates when it comes to their feelings on democracy, voting, authoritarianism, or even the Constitution. You study this stuff, you poll Americans, you've just written yet another very important book. What do you think should be the conversation? Likely it won't be, and likely even if they were asked, their questions would be offensive and disappointing, but still relevant to millions of Americans to ask these questions, which you have been asking yourself and answering through your research and work for years now.
Well, I think a commitment to democracy is front and center, and so like these fundamental questions, I think the reporters have been trying to get, candidates, will you commit, right, to accepting a loss, right? Or is the only legitimate outcome that you win? I mean, if you're really for democracy, you got to accept the possibility that you're going to come up short, even with your best efforts. And I think the other thing, too, that any rhetoric that starts sounding like, instead of, these are our political opponents with whom we disagree, but that starts sounding like, no, these are evil people who are our enemies and who are out to destroy the country, right? We hear that language elevated, right?
I mean, or even worse, these Democrats are sexually attacking and abusing children. They're pedophiles. That's like, this is some mainstream rhetoric from members of the right elected in Congress, in state legislatures, even more predominantly, sadly, and obviously in media where there's no consequences hardly at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right. And at the root of that is the assignment of evil, right, as the category, as the adjective to your political opponents.
Sure.
Right. And and I think that's the real danger, because that's just fundamentally corrosive to any sense of democracy or fair play and democratic elections. Because if you raise the stakes that high, then really all means become justified, right? Including violence, by the way.
It also would seem that the key factor today, and we talk about this a lot, but maybe not enough because we just talk about it so much, maybe it doesn't resonate, but is voting and access to voting. I mean, this is kind of a theme within your work and within your book. Of course, American history and the franchise and the Constitution and suffrage and the voting rights movement and Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court recently gutted. And it's the same day they did. Old states, Confederate states, took advantage of it and made it harder for likely Democrats, specifically black and brown folks, to vote. I mean, that seems to be one of the most important issues of our day. And I think that's what obviously you meant when it comes to democracy, but specifically on voting, Robbie.
No, that's right. I mean, back to this point I made, that white suppression of the vote in the Mississippi Delta in the 1950s was so thorough that there were literally zero African Americans, in a county that's like half African American.
How about that?
Really zero. That's how thoroughly the vote had been suppressed. And that's why those laws got passed in the first place.
I guess the reversal of that, of course, is where there are a lot of black voters. Those places are considered to have fraudulent elections. Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee. Hey, those are key states, too, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, where there's a ton of black people voting. Somehow they cheated. When they do vote, when they have access to voting, they are indicated as they are accused of cheating.
Yeah, and underneath all of that, right, there is some way in which the underlying sentiment that fuels all of that isn't that far off of the Doctrine of Discovery, right? It's that these aren't real Americans. Their vote shouldn't really count as much as ours, right? There's something illegitimate. There must be something illegitimate, right, about it if we're not winning, because after all, this country was created to be ours.
Can you recall that James Baldwin quote about white folks and our disease?
Oh, well, I can probably do it some justice. It gets certainly rung in my head. It's actually a real motivation for me to continue to write along these lines. He was asked about white people and kind of what African Americans thought about. You got it?
Yeah, there's a short version that I've heard you quote, but I read the longer version. I'll read the longer version that you quote here. This is James Baldwin, of course. Negroes know far more about white Americans than that. It can almost be said, in fact, that they know about white Americans what parents or anyway mothers know about their children, and that they often regard white Americans that way. And perhaps this attitude, held in spite of what they know and have endured, helps to explain why Negroes on the whole, and until lately, have allowed themselves to feel so little hatred. The tendency has been, insofar as this was possible, to dismiss white people as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. That last part, as painful as it was for me to say Negroes. That last part, dismiss white people as a slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. What's he saying?
I mean, that line has stayed with me. Yeah, slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. And, I think when we see like some of the just ridiculous moves, like the banning of AP African American history, not counting it toward graduation in Arkansas, right? The attacks on AP African American history and psychology in Florida. And you think have they lost their minds? And I think the answer to that is yes. Right. That there's literally a way in which we've moved ourselves into such an unhealthy space by such massive denial of our own history that it moves us into our QAnon. How in the world, right, can we have 17% of the country believing that there's a cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles, right?
I wonder if we're dismissing those responsible when we say, have they lost their minds? Because to some extent, people are victims of some narrative that they've been sold. But I do believe that Christopher Rufo and Ron DeSantis and a whole Tucker Carlson are architects of these beliefs that get them put into actual policy and laws in Arkansas and Florida. So they haven't lost their minds, but they are selling these ideas to people who easily are. Is maybe what.
Yeah, and I think that's a great distinction. I think I'm referring to the susceptibility, right, of masses of people. Like, why would this even begin to be appealing? And I think it is, they're in this kind of desperate state when the world is. There's this great phrase I read, and I'm not going to call the source here, but it was actually somebody right after the Civil War. It was a white Confederate veteran right after the Civil War, and it was a kind of agricultural metaphor that he used, and he said, what are we going to do with a society where the bottom rail is on top? And what he meant by that, right, is the world is literally upside down. Now that black people can vote, now that we can't enslave them, this entire thing that we committed ourselves to is unraveling has unraveled at the seams. And I feel like we're at another of those kind of moments where for many white Christian people who really thought the country was theirs, this literally is the country, or the country. And Trump says, when Trump says, if you don't vote for me, you don't support for me, you'll not have a country anymore. Like that phrase, right? This is what he means, right? That country you won't have anymore.
Take back America. Yeah. Take back America. Make America great again. Yeah. And what was the Tea Party thing was, I guess that was Take Back America from Obama.
Right.
That kind of rhetoric, of course, it all can come back to the Doctrine of Discovery. And this book really does such a great job as to framing it all for us. It should be a necessary read for everybody. Congratulations. I can tell, I can imagine that it was a tremendous amount of work to do this research and to get it out. And you continue to be such a valuable teacher to us as you learn yourself. Thank you so much for joining me again, and keep up the good work. And let's talk again, Robbie. Really, really appreciate you.
All right. Thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me on.
Robbie Jones, get the book, everybody, in the show links. And thank you very much for listening to today's podcast. I've got another couple coming over the next couple of days, so I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Julia Jeske of Decoding Fox News. And that's all. That's it. I will talk to you later. Thank you very much for listening, subscribing, supporting the show. Hope to see you at the Hangout tonight. And let's let John Carroll take us out. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels been leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know us right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. Let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny what
face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. While you lying awake wondering where the money all went, it'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.